Have you ever wondered what evil looks like when it wears a smile? In March of 1932, a health inspector climbing into the remote hollows of eastern Kentucky discovered something that would redefine what isolation could do to a family. The county birth records showed 5 children born to the Cottle household over 12 years, but the inspector's report, filed with the state medical board and sealed for decades, contained a single handwritten note in the margin. All 5 share the same parents, but the mother and grandmother are the same woman. Before we dive into the story, if you're someone who believes that understanding our darkest history helps us prevent future tragedies, then this channel is for you. We examine the cases that textbooks often ignore, the stories buried in sealed records and forgotten archives. Click the like button and subscribe. Also, write where you are and what time it is as you listen. I like to see where the past finds its way into the present. Now let's continue with the story. Harold Jessup had been a county health inspector for the Commonwealth of Kentucky for 7 years when he received the assignment that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The request came through routine channels, a typewritten memo from the state capitol in Frankfort directing him to conduct a welfare check on the Cottle family residing somewhere in the upper reaches of Breathitt County, where the mountain ridges pressed so close together that entire hollows remained in shadow until midday. The Depression had stretched state resources thin, and rural inspections had become irregular at best. This particular family hadn't been visited by any official in over a decade, possibly longer. The records were vague, contradictory, maintained with the haphazard attention typical of overwhelmed county clerks, managing dozens of isolated families scattered across terrain that resisted all attempts at systematic organization. Jessup prepared for the journey with the thoroughness that had earned him commendations during his tenure. He packed his leather medical bag with basic examination tools, vaccination records, forms for documenting household conditions, and enough supplies for what he anticipated would be an overnight trip. The address listed on the assignment consisted of nothing more than a family name and a general geographic area. Cottle family, Upper East Ridge, Breathitt County. No street existed, no house number, no landmarks that would appear on any map. This was typical for the most remote homesteads where families had lived for generations, on land claimed through occupation rather than legal deed, passed down through word and tradition rather than courthouse documentation. The journey began on a coal company road that had been carved into the mountainside during the brief boom years of the 1920s. When mineral extraction companies had pushed their operations deeper into previously inaccessible territories. But the road had been maintained for corporate profit, not public service, and it deteriorated rapidly once the company pulled out following the economic collapse. What had once accommodated trucks now barely supported Jessup's sedan, the ruts and washouts forcing him to navigate carefully around sections where the road had simply surrendered to erosion and slid down the slope. After 2 hours of slow progress, the road finally ended at what had once been a coal loading station, now abandoned and slowly being reclaimed by vegetation. Jessup parked his vehicle and continued on foot, following directions provided by the county office. Follow the old logging trail north until it splits. Take the eastern fork. Continue until you reach a creek crossing. Then look for a footpath marked by 3 stacked stones on the uphill side. His guide for this final leg was Vernon Watts, the postal carrier who serviced the remote families twice monthly, one of the few outsiders who ventured regularly into the high hollows. Watts was a lean man in his 50s, weathered by decades of mountain travel, who moved with the efficient economy of someone who'd learned to conserve energy over long distances. He carried a walking stick carved from hickory, worn smooth by years of use, and he set a pace that Jessup struggled to match despite being 20 years younger. As they climbed, Watts shared what little he knew about the Cottle family. Ezra Cottle, the household patriarch, collected supplies from a drop point about a mile below his property. Watts left packages there and picked up outgoing mail, rare as it was. He had seen Ezra perhaps 30 times over 8 years, always the same brief, wordless exchange. "He's not a talker," Watts explained, his breathing steady despite the steep incline. "Mountain folk can be quiet, but Ezra takes it to another level. Never asks about weather crops, nothing. Just takes his goods and leaves." Watts had never been invited to the cabin itself, nor had he asked to visit. Mountain culture valued privacy above almost all other considerations, and interfering in another family's business violated codes that ran deeper than written law. But Watts admitted he'd always found something unsettling about the coddle arrangement. The children he'd glimpsed on rare occasions didn't seem quite right. They moved strangely, looked different from other mountain children, though he couldn't articulate exactly how. Once, several years earlier, he'd mentioned his concerns to men at the general store in the settlement below. They'd listened in silence, their faces carefully neutral. Then someone had changed the subject to tobacco prices. The message was clear. Whatever happened on Ezra Cottle's property was Ezra Cottle's business. The trail switchbacked up the eastern face of a ridge that seemed to climb forever, each turn revealing another stretch of steep ascent through thick forest that pressed in from both sides. Jessup's city-bought boots, adequate for walking county roads, proved inadequate for the rocky, root-crossed path. He slipped twice, catching himself on tree trunks, feeling the burn in his thighs as muscles unaccustomed to such sustained climbing began to protest. 3 hours after leaving his vehicle, they finally emerged into a clearing that felt less like an arrival and more like a wound in the forest. The surrounding trees stopped abruptly at an invisible boundary, leaving an open space of perhaps 2 acres where a cabin stood in stark isolation. The structure appeared to have been built in stages over many years, starting with a core of hand-hewn logs dark with age and weather, then expanded with additions that used progressively cruder materials. The roof consisted of split wooden shingles, many of them curling or missing entirely, patched in places with what looked like flattened tin cans. Smoke rose from a stone chimney that leaned slightly, as though the entire structure was slowly surrendering to gravity's patient pull. The clearing itself showed signs of subsistence farming. A vegetable garden surrounded by a makeshift fence of stacked branches, several chickens scratching in the dirt, a lean-to structure that probably housed a pig or goat, though Jessup couldn't see any animals from where he stood. Everything about the scene spoke of profound isolation, of a family that had turned inward away from the outside world, creating a self-contained existence that required almost nothing from the society beyond the ridge. A man emerged from the cabin as Jessup and Watts approached. Ezra Cottle was tall, perhaps 6'2", with a raw-boned frame that suggested both strength and deprivation. His clothes hung loosely on a body that carried no excess weight. Patched work pants held up by rope suspenders, a homespun shirt that had faded to a nondescript gray. But it was his eyes that arrested Jessup's attention, pale blue, almost colorless in the morning light, studying the visitors with an intensity that held no warmth, no welcome, no curiosity, just assessment, calculation, the look of someone determining threat levels and necessary responses. Ezra said nothing for a long moment, standing in the cabin doorway like a sentinel, his presence declaring that this property, this family, existed under his authority alone. Behind him, through the open door, Jessup caught glimpses of movement in the cabin's dark interior. Shadows that suggested multiple people but revealed no details. The silence stretched uncomfortably, broken only by the wind moving through the surrounding trees and the distant call of a crow. When Ezra finally spoke, his voice carried the distinctive flattened vowels and dropped consonants of deep mountain dialect, a way of speaking that had evolved in isolation from standard English, preserving linguistic patterns from centuries earlier, while developing its own unique variations. "Don't need no inspection," he stated, the words coming slowly as though speech itself was a resource to be conserved. "Family's well, don't need no government concern." Jessup introduced himself, explained his official capacity, and cited the legal authority granted to health inspectors conducting wellness checks on families with minor children. Kentucky law, he stated carefully, gave him the right to verify the health and safety of all children in the household. The birth records indicated at least 3 children under the age of 12, possibly more. He needed to examine them, document their conditions, ensure they were receiving adequate nutrition and basic care. Ezra's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his posture, a subtle tensing that suggested barely contained resistance. He glanced at Watts, who'd stepped back slightly, making clear this was official business and not a social call. The postal carrier's face remained carefully neutral, offering no support to either side of the confrontation. "Children are fine," Ezra repeated, his tone flat. "Fine. Living as we always have. Don't need outsiders bringing trouble." But Jessup had conducted enough rural inspections to recognize when resistance indicated something beyond normal mountain privacy. He'd encountered defensive parents before, families who viewed government officials with justified suspicion given the region's history of exploitation by coal companies and corrupt politicians. Usually that defensiveness softened once he explained he was there to help, not punish. Ezra's resistance felt different. It carried an edge of genuine menace, a warning that trespassing beyond this point would have consequences. Still, Kentucky law was clear, and Jessup had both legal authority and moral obligation to proceed. He stated, with more confidence than he felt, that he would need to enter the cabin and examine the children. If Ezra refused to cooperate, Jessup would return with the sheriff and a court order, which would make the situation far more difficult for everyone involved. Something flickered in Ezra's pale eyes, some calculation weighing options and outcomes. Finally, without speaking, he stepped aside from the doorway, a gesture that granted permission while simultaneously communicating that this intrusion was noted, recorded, and would not be forgotten. Jessup stepped forward, his heart pounding harder than the climb alone could explain, and crossed the threshold into the Cottle cabin, into a darkness that would reveal horrors he'd never imagined possible in the American heartland of the 20th century. The interior of the Cottle cabin revealed a scene that initially appeared unremarkable for the impoverished mountain households Jessup had visited throughout his career. A cast-iron stove occupied one corner. Rough-hewn furniture lined the walls. But as his eyes adjusted to the dim light filtering through oil-paper windows, he noticed the inhabitants themselves, and something fundamental shifted in his understanding of what he was witnessing. Two women sat near the stove, both sharing Ezra's sharp cheekbones and narrow build. The younger couldn't have been more than 30, though her worn hands suggested decades of hard labor. The older woman, perhaps 50, watched Jessup with an expression he couldn't decipher. 3 children huddled near the far wall, their ages difficult to determine. One boy appeared around 10 but had the physical proportions of a much younger child. A girl who might have been 7 or 8 stared at him with eyes that seemed too large for her face. Jessup began his standard examination, asking to see the children's vaccination records, inquiring about their schooling, checking for obvious signs of malnutrition or abuse. Ezra answered most questions with terse negatives. No, the children had never attended school. The nearest was 15 miles away. No, they had no vaccination records. Yes, they had enough to eat from their garden and livestock. When Jessup asked for the children's names and birth dates, Ezra gestured toward the younger woman. "That's Sarah, she'll tell you." Sarah's voice emerged barely above a whisper as she recited information that Jessup carefully noted in his inspection book. But something about the way she spoke, the way she glanced at Ezra before answering each question, troubled him in ways he couldn't yet articulate. The older woman, introduced simply as Martha, said nothing throughout the entire visit. She kept her attention fixed on some needlework in her lap, though Jessup noticed her hands had stopped moving. Back at the county office 3 days later, Jessup began the tedious work of cross-referencing his notes with official records. The birth certificates for the Cottle children existed, filed properly with the county clerk. But as he laid them out across his desk, inconsistencies began emerging like fault lines in bedrock. Sarah Cottle was listed as mother on all 5 certificates spanning 12 years. Yet no father's name appeared on any of them. The certificates indicated Sarah herself had been born in 1902, making her barely 15 when the first child arrived. He pulled the marriage records. No marriage license existed for any Sarah Cottle in Breathitt County. He checked the death records, thinking perhaps she'd been widowed. Nothing. Then he requested Sarah's own birth certificate, and when it arrived from the State Archive in Frankfurt, he sat staring at the document for a full minute before reaching for the telephone. Sarah's birth certificate listed Ezra Cottle as father and Martha Cottle as mother. The woman he'd assumed was Sarah's mother was actually her sister, and the man standing in that doorway, the patriarch who controlled every word spoken in that cabin, was father not just to Sarah and Martha, but to every child in that household across 3 generations. The family tree didn't branch outward. It coiled back upon itself in a loop that violated every biological and moral boundary Jessup had believed inviolate. Jessup's telephone call to the state medical board in Frankfurt brought Dr. Raymond Pritchard, a physician specializing in hereditary conditions, to Breathitt County within the week. Together, they made the 3-hour climb back up the mountain, this time with legal authority compelling the Cottle family to submit to medical examination. Ezra met them at the clearing's edge, his face carved from stone. But Kentucky law left him no choice but to comply. What the medical examination revealed transformed a case of suspected abuse into something far more scientifically disturbing. The 5 children ranged in age from 3 to 14, but each displayed physical abnormalities that Dr. Pritchard documented with clinical precision in his leather-bound examination journal. The oldest boy, Thomas, had a pronounced curvature of the spine and legs that bowed inward at angles that made walking difficult. His cognitive function, Pritchard noted, appeared severely limited. He could not answer simple questions about his age or the current season. The 7-year-old girl, Rebecca, possessed the enlarged cranium characteristic of hydrocephalus, though the condition had somehow not proved fatal. Her vision was severely impaired, her eyes clouded with congenital cataracts. The youngest child, a boy of 3 called Samuel, had not yet learned to walk and showed no interest in doing so, content to drag himself across the cabin floor using only his arms. But it was the household structure itself that revealed the true horror of what had transpired on this isolated mountain. Through careful questioning, Pritchard pieced together a timeline that made Jessup's stomach turn. Sarah had borne her first child at 15, fathered by Ezra. She'd given birth to 4 more over the following years, each with progressively more severe abnormalities. Martha, younger than Sarah by 3 years, had also begun bearing Ezra's children at age 16. 2 of her offspring had died in infancy, according to whispered admissions, buried somewhere on the property in unmarked graves. The women existed in a state Pritchard described in his notes as conditioned captivity. They had never traveled beyond the ridge. Neither could read or write. They spoke only when Ezra granted permission, and even then in voices that carried the flatness of profound resignation. Sarah, at 30, moved with the defeated posture of a woman twice her age. Martha's hands shook constantly, a tremor Pritchard attributed to chronic malnutrition and psychological trauma rather than any neurological condition. When Pritchard asked Sarah directly about her relationship to Ezra, she simply stated he was her father, and the father of her children, as though this arrangement carried no more moral weight than commenting on the weather. The concept that this might be wrong, illegal, or harmful seemed entirely foreign to her understanding. She had known no other life, no other possibility of existence. The mountain had been her entire world, and Ezra had been its sole authority. Ezra himself refused to answer any questions beyond confirming basic facts. He showed no remorse, no shame, no recognition that his actions had created a genetic catastrophe. When Pritchard attempted to explain the medical consequences of inbreeding, Ezra simply turned away and began splitting firewood, each strike of the axe a declaration that he recognized no law but his own. The doctor's report, filed with both state medical authorities and the county prosecutor, used language rarely seen in official documents. Willful genetic destruction through repeated incestuous assault across multiple victims and generations. The question that haunted investigators wasn't just how this had happened, but how it had continued undetected for nearly 2 decades. The Cottle property sat at an elevation that placed it above even the scattered homesteads that dotted the lower slopes. No road reached within 3 miles. During winter months, snow could make the footpath impassable for weeks. The nearest neighbor, a widower named Hosea Combs, who lived an hour's walk down the mountain, told investigators he'd seen Ezra perhaps twice a year when the older man came to collect supplies left at the trail junction. He'd never once been invited to the Cottle cabin, nor had he asked to visit. When pressed about whether he'd suspected anything wrong, Combs looked at his boots and spoke carefully. "Mountain folks don't pry into another man's family business. That's how it's always been up here." This code of fierce privacy, born from generations of hardship and self-reliance, had created an environment where even obvious signs of trouble went deliberately unnoticed. To interfere would be to invite interference in return, and most families harbored their own secrets they preferred to keep buried. The Baptist church in the nearest settlement had baptized several of the coddled children. Reverend Marcus Thorne, who'd held the position since 1926, remembered performing the ceremonies but claimed ignorance of the family's true structure. The baptismal records listed only the children's names and approximate ages, with no documentation of family relationships. When investigators questioned why he hadn't inquired further, Thorne stated that he'd assumed the children belonged to various relatives living together, a common enough arrangement during the Depression when extended families pooled resources for survival. The economic collapse of 1929 had further isolated the family. Government services, already thin in rural Kentucky, had been cut to the bone. Health inspections that might have occurred every 2 years now happened only when specific complaints arose. The Cottle family generated no complaints because no one from the outside world witnessed their daily existence long enough to recognize what was unfolding. Even the county clerk who'd filed the birth certificates had noticed the irregularities, but dismissed them as clerical errors or mountain folk confusion about dates and relationships. The mountain had protected Ezra's crimes not through malice, but through indifference, isolation, and a culture that valued privacy above all other considerations. By the time authorities finally breached that isolation, the damage had already consumed 2 generations and was advancing into a third. Dr. Pritchard's full medical assessment, completed over 3 separate visits to the Cottle cabin, produced a document that would later be studied in medical schools as an example of extreme genetic deterioration. Each child represented a compounding of recessive traits that would typically remain hidden in normal populations, but emerged with devastating clarity when the gene pool collapsed upon itself. Thomas, the 14-year-old, suffered from what Pritchard identified as a severe form of skeletal dysplasia. His bones had developed with insufficient calcium density, making fractures commonplace. Hospital records from a brief stay 2 years earlier, discovered during the investigation, noted that Thomas had broken his left arm simply by lifting a water bucket. The attending physician had attributed it to rickets and malnutrition, never suspecting the underlying genetic cause. Beyond the physical deformities, Pritchard documented profound cognitive impairments. Thomas could not count beyond 5. He possessed no concept of time or seasons, despite living 14 years. When shown a mirror, he displayed no recognition of his own reflection, a failure of self-awareness that suggested deeper neurological damage. His speech consisted of perhaps 20 words, most related to basic needs like food and water. Rebecca's condition proved even more heartbreaking. The fluid pressing against her brain had been slowly increasing since birth, and without surgical intervention, which was impossible given the family's isolation and poverty. She experienced chronic headaches so severe she would sometimes beat her own head against the cabin wall for relief. The cataracts clouding her vision had progressed to near total blindness. Pritchard estimated she could distinguish only between light and darkness. Yet she'd developed an acute sensitivity to sound, turning her head toward voices with an accuracy that suggested her brain had compensated for the lost vision by enhancing other senses. The younger children showed their own catalog of afflictions. 9-year-old Joseph had been born with a cleft palate so severe that eating solid food remained difficult. His speech was nearly incomprehensible even to his own family. 6-year-old Esther possessed fingers that had fused together in the womb, creating hand structures that resembled mittens more than functional appendages. She could grasp objects only clumsily, dropping them frequently. 3-year-old Samuel represented perhaps the most severe case. His legs had developed with bones so malformed that they could never support his weight. His spine curved in ways that compressed his internal organs, leading to chronic digestive problems and breathing difficulties. Pritchard's examination revealed an enlarged heart struggling to pump blood through a circulatory system compromised by multiple structural abnormalities. The doctor privately estimated Samuel would not survive beyond age 10. What made these conditions particularly tragic was their preventability. Had even one generation married outside the immediate family, the genetic damage would have been diluted, potentially avoiding the most severe manifestations. Instead, Ezra had created a closed loop where harmful recessive genes met their matches with each pregnancy. expressing themselves in increasingly catastrophic combinations. Pritchard's report included a section that would be quoted in medical journals for decades. The human genome requires diversity to maintain integrity. When that diversity collapses to a single lineage, repeatedly folding back upon itself, the results are not merely predictable, but inevitable. These children are not anomalies of nature, but mathematical certainties of genetic mathematics gone terribly wrong. The State Medical Board, upon receiving the full documentation, immediately classified the case as a public health emergency requiring intervention at the highest level. The legal machinery of Kentucky ground slowly in 1932, particularly when confronting a case without clear precedent. County Prosecutor Daniel Herron found himself navigating statute books that addressed incest as a crime, but offered little guidance for situations involving multiple victims across extended time frames. The laws assumed discrete incidents between adults, not systematic abuse spanning nearly 2 decades with children born as living evidence. Herron's first obstacle emerged immediately. Sarah and Martha, now adults, refused to testify against Ezra. When interviewed separately by a female social worker brought from Lexington, both women insisted they'd never been harmed. Sarah stated plainly that Ezra had provided for her, kept a roof over her head, and fathered children who needed caring for. The concept that she'd been victimized seemed incomprehensible to her. She'd known no other father, no other man, no other possible life configuration. Martha proved even more resistant to intervention. She wouldn't speak at all in Ezra's presence and could barely whisper responses when alone with investigators. Her hands shook violently during questioning, and twice she fainted when pressed for details about when the abuse had begun. The psychological damage ran so deep that extracting testimony appeared impossible without causing further harm. The children themselves could provide no useful witness statements. Thomas lacked the cognitive capacity to understand questions about his parentage. Rebecca, blind and suffering, could only confirm that Ezra was her father, a fact that held no suspicious weight in her limited understanding. The younger children simply parroted whatever Sarah told them to say. Herron then confronted a second problem that threatened to derail the entire prosecution. Kentucky law in 1932 defined incest specifically as relations between parent and child, or between siblings. But the law remained silent on the status of children born from such unions. Were Sarah's children legally considered Ezra's children or his grandchildren? The distinction mattered enormously for determining which specific statutes applied. Several law professors consulted by the state attorney general admitted the situation existed in a legal gray zone that had never been properly addressed. Ezra himself, when finally brought to the county courthouse for questioning, sat in silence for most of the proceeding. He'd retained no attorney, claimed he needed none, and refused to acknowledge the authority of the court to interfere in his family affairs. When Judge Clement Breckinridge directly asked if he understood he'd fathered children with his own daughters, Ezra simply stated, "They're my family. I provided for them. That's all that matters." The judge, visibly shaken, ordered a psychiatric evaluation to determine Ezra's competency to stand trial. The evaluation, conducted over 2 days by Dr. William Kendrick from the state hospital, concluded that Ezra suffered from no mental defect or illness that would impair his understanding of right and wrong. He simply rejected the premise that his actions were criminal. In Kendrick's assessment, Ezra possessed a moral framework entirely divorced from societal norms, constructed through isolation and unchecked patriarchal authority. By April of 1932, 3 months after the initial inspection, the case remained legally stalled. Prosecutors had abundant evidence but uncooperative victims. They had a defendant who acknowledged the facts but denied any wrongdoing, and they had 5 severely damaged children who required immediate intervention, regardless of whether criminal charges could successfully proceed. While prosecutors wrestled with legal technicalities, the children's physical conditions continued deteriorating at alarming rates. Dr. Pritchard submitted an urgent memorandum to the state health commissioner warning that without immediate medical intervention, at least 2 of the children would likely die within the year. This medical emergency provided the legal leverage that criminal statutes could not. In May of 1932, Judge Breckinridge issued an order removing all 5 children from the Cottle household on grounds of medical neglect and imminent danger to their welfare. Sheriff Boyd Tackett, accompanied by 2 deputies and a nurse from the county hospital, made the climb up the mountain to execute the order. What they encountered was Sarah blocking the cabin doorway, her thin frame planted like she could physically prevent the removal of her children through sheer will. The scene that unfolded traumatized everyone present. Rebecca, sensing the disturbance, began screaming with such intensity that she vomited. Thomas grabbed a piece of firewood and swung it wildly, striking one deputy across the shoulder before being restrained. Young Esther clung to Sarah's legs with her fused fingers, wailing in terror. Only Ezra remained calm, standing in the yard with his arms crossed, watching the chaos with an expression that Sheriff Tackett later described as satisfaction, like he'd orchestrated the whole thing to prove we were the villains. The transport down the mountain took 6 hours. Thomas had to be carried by 2 men working in shifts. Rebecca's screaming continued until she passed out from exhaustion halfway down the trail. Samuel, too weak to cry, simply went limp in the nurse's arms, his breathing shallow. By the time they reached the county hospital, all 5 children were in various states of medical crisis. The hospital staff had been warned to expect severe cases, but nothing prepared them for the reality. Young Samuel stopped breathing twice during his first night, requiring emergency intervention each time. Rebecca's intracranial pressure had spiked from the stress, causing seizures that left her unconscious for 3 days. Thomas tried to escape twice, making it as far as the hospital grounds before being gently returned. He bit a nurse who attempted to bathe him, drawing blood. Dr. Helena Vance, who specialized in pediatric care, took charge of the children's treatment. Her nursing notes, preserved in hospital archives, reveal the staggering scope of their medical needs. Thomas required surgical intervention to prevent his spine from collapsing further. Rebecca needed a shunt installed to drain the excess fluid from her skull, a risky procedure with high mortality rates. Joseph's cleft palate demanded reconstruction surgery he should have received years earlier. Esther's fused fingers could potentially be separated, though the surgery would be painful and the outcome uncertain. But beyond the physical ailments, Dr. Vance noted something even more disturbing in her psychological assessments. The children possessed no conception of the world beyond their mountain. They'd never seen a town, never encountered more than a handful of people, never experienced electric lights or running water. Rebecca asked repeatedly for Sarah, her voice hoarse from crying. Thomas wouldn't eat food prepared by strangers, convinced it was poisoned. They existed in a state of profound developmental deprivation that rivaled their genetic damage. Samuel, the youngest and most fragile, died on his 4th night in the hospital. His tiny body simply surrendered, overwhelmed by the combined stress of separation and systemic organ failure. His malformed heart could no longer sustain him. Samuel's death finally broke the community's silence. What had been whispered about in general stores and church basements now erupted into public outrage. The Breathitt County Courier ran its first front-page story about the case, though carefully worded to avoid libel while the criminal proceedings remained unresolved. Within days, newspapers from Lexington and Louisville descended on the county, transforming a local tragedy into a statewide scandal. The publicity forced uncomfortable reckonings throughout the community. Reverend Thorne faced angry congregants who demanded to know why he'd baptized obviously suffering children without investigating their home situation. He resigned his position within a week, leaving the pulpit he'd occupied for 6 years. The county clerk who'd filed the birth certificates without question found herself suspended pending an administrative review. Even postal carrier Vernon Watts received threats from townspeople who called him complicit through his silence. Hosea Combs, the nearest neighbor, provided the most damning testimony during a community meeting held at the courthouse. He admitted he'd heard Sarah screaming one night years earlier, a sound that carried down the mountain through the still air. He'd mentioned it to his brother, who'd advised him to mind his own business. "We all knew something evil was happening up there," Combs said, his voice breaking. "But we told ourselves it wasn't our place to interfere. We chose peace over doing what was right, and those children paid the price for our cowardice." The mountain communities of eastern Kentucky operated on codes older than the state itself, values forged through centuries of isolation and self-reliance. But Samuel's small coffin, buried in the county cemetery because Ezra refused to claim the body, represented the ultimate failure of those codes. The old ways had protected a monster and destroyed innocence. Sarah and Martha remained on the mountain throughout this upheaval, though social workers visited weekly to assess their well-being. Sarah had withdrawn into near-complete silence after the children's removal. She spent her days sitting in the cabin doorway, staring down the trail as though expecting them to return. Martha's condition worsened dramatically. She stopped eating regularly and lost weight her thin frame couldn't spare. When a social worker suggested they might leave, find lives away from Ezra, Sarah looked at her with genuine confusion. Leave for where? To do what? Ezra himself seemed energized by the attention. He began making trips down to the settlement, something he'd rarely done before, apparently enjoying his newfound notoriety. He'd sit outside the general store, daring anyone to confront him directly. Most people crossed the street to avoid him. Those who did speak to him reported that he showed no remorse whatsoever, insisting he'd done nothing wrong, and that the state had stolen his children. In July of 1932, the prosecutor finally assembled enough evidence to proceed with criminal charges. The indictment listed 4 counts of incest and 5 counts of child endangerment. Ezra was arrested without incident and held on $10,000 bond, an amount impossible for him to raise. His trial was scheduled for September, and the entire county waited to see whether justice could be extracted from a case that had exposed the darkest possibilities of human isolation and unchecked authority. The children remained hospitalized, their recovery complicated by trauma that ran deeper than any physical wound. The trial never happened. On August 14, 1932, Ezra Cottle suffered a massive stroke in his jail cell. Deputies found him collapsed on the floor at morning rounds, the left side of his body already paralyzed. He was transported to the county hospital where he lingered for 3 days before dying without regaining consciousness. He was 58 years old. His death eliminated any possibility of criminal conviction, but did nothing to resolve the human wreckage he'd created. Sarah received news of his passing with no visible emotion. She didn't attend the burial, a sparse affair attended only by the sheriff and a minister who read perfunctory prayers over a pine coffin. Ezra was interred in the far corner of the county cemetery, his grave deliberately isolated from the rest of the plots. No marker was ever placed. With Ezra gone, the question of what would become of Sarah and Martha took on new urgency. Social workers from the state welfare office assessed both women and concluded they possessed neither the education nor the psychological capacity to live independently. Sarah, at 30, had the practical life skills of a sheltered child. She could cook over an open fire and tend a garden, but she'd never handled money, never navigated a town, never made a decision without Ezra's approval. Martha's condition had deteriorated to the point where she required constant supervision. She'd begun talking to herself, long conversations with people who weren't there. The state arranged for both women to be placed in the Kentucky Training Home for the Feeble-Minded in Frankfort, a sprawling institution that housed over 800 residents by 1933. The name reflected the era's crude understanding of mental disability, making no distinction between intellectual impairment and psychological trauma. Sarah and Martha were classified as morons in the official paperwork, a technical term of the period that measured supposed intelligence levels. Their departure from the mountain came on a cold morning in October. Sarah took 1 bundle of possessions, clothing, a worn Bible she couldn't read, and a photograph of the children taken during one of Dr. Pritchard's visits. Martha brought nothing. They rode in the back of a state vehicle, watching the only landscape they'd ever known disappear behind them. Neither spoke during the 4-hour journey to Frankfurt. The institution would be their home for the remainder of their lives. Records show Sarah adapted better than Martha to the regimented environment. She worked in the laundry and proved reliable at simple, repetitive tasks. Staff notes describe her as quiet, compliant, and deeply sad. She asked about her children constantly during the first year, less frequently as time passed. She never fully grasped that what Ezra had done to her was wrong. In her understanding, he'd been her father and her husband. 2 roles that never conflicted in the closed world of that mountain cabin. Martha's mental state continued its collapse. By 1934, she'd stopped speaking entirely. She spent her days rocking in a chair by a window, occasionally making sounds that approximated humming. Institutional physicians diagnosed her with what they termed dementia praecox, an early classification for what would later be understood as schizophrenia, though her condition likely stemmed from profound, untreated trauma rather than organic brain disease. The children's fates proved equally grim. Rebecca died in 1935 from complications related to her hydrocephalus. The shunt installed to drain fluid had become infected, and her weakened immune system couldn't fight the resulting sepsis. She was 11 years old. Thomas was transferred to a state facility for the mentally disabled, where he lived in near-total institutionalization until his death from pneumonia in 1941 at age 23. Joseph and Esther survived into adulthood but never left institutional care. Joseph's speech remained severely impaired despite surgical repairs to his palate, and his cognitive limitations prevented any form of independent living. Esther learned to use her partially separated fingers with some dexterity, but struggled with tasks requiring fine motor control. Both remained wards of the state until their deaths in the 1950s. The Cottle cabin stood empty on its mountain ridge, gradually surrendering to weather and time. By 1940, the roof had collapsed. By 1950, only the stone chimney remained standing, a monument to nothing anyone wanted to remember. The Cottle case disappeared from public consciousness almost as quickly as it had emerged. By 1933, the Depression dominated headlines, and a tragedy in rural Kentucky seemed less urgent than widespread economic collapse. The official records were sealed by court order in 1935, ostensibly to protect the surviving children's privacy, but effectively bearing evidence of systemic failures that had enabled the horror. Those records remained sealed until 1972, when Dr. Margaret Hoffman, a geneticist researching hereditary disorders at the University of Kentucky, petitioned for access while compiling case studies of extreme genetic bottlenecking. What she discovered in those dusty archived files shocked her. Despite decades of studying human genetics, the Cottle case represented one of the most severe examples of sustained inbreeding documented in American medical history. Hoffman's analysis, published in the Journal of Medical Genetics in 1974, examined the case through a modern scientific lens. She calculated that the children born to Sarah and Martha possessed what's called a coefficient of inbreeding exceeding 0.25, meaning they were more genetically similar to themselves than typical siblings. The probability of harmful recessive genes expressing themselves approached mathematical certainty. Every pregnancy represented a genetic dice roll where the odds were catastrophically stacked against a healthy outcome. The study became required reading in medical genetics programs, though the family name was changed to protect descendants. Hoffman's work demonstrated how geographic isolation, poverty, and patriarchal control could create conditions where basic genetic principles manifested with brutal clarity. The human genome, shaped by hundreds of thousands of years of diverse breeding populations, simply cannot sustain multiple generations of such extreme inbreeding without catastrophic breakdown. But beyond the genetics, the case exposed failures that extended throughout society. The legal system of 1930s Kentucky possessed no framework for addressing multi-generational sexual abuse. The medical establishment had spotted signs of genetic trouble in hospital records as early as 1928, but never investigated the underlying cause. The religious community had baptized obviously suffering children without asking difficult questions. The neighbors had chosen silence over intervention. Harold Jessup, the inspector whose routine visit had uncovered the nightmare, left government service in 1934. He moved to Ohio and never spoke publicly about the case. His daughter, interviewed in 1996 for a documentary project, said her father had nightmares about the Cottle children for the rest of his life. He'd wake up describing Rebecca's screams, Thomas's confusion, little Samuel's labored breathing. He died in 1962, taking whatever guilt and trauma he carried to his grave. Dr. Pritchard's examination notes became teaching materials at the University of Louisville School of Medicine, demonstrating both the medical consequences of inbreeding and the importance of mandatory reporting laws. Kentucky substantially strengthened its child welfare statutes in 1934, directly in response to the case, though the changes came too late for the Cottle children. The mountain itself reclaimed the property where so much suffering had occurred. Modern hikers occasionally stumble across the stone chimney, now covered in vines, with no idea of the history it represents. The County Historical Society briefly considered marking the site in the 1980s but decided against it. Some histories, they concluded, serve better as warnings than as tourist attractions. Sarah lived until 1968, dying in the Frankfurt institution at age 66. Her death certificate listed pneumonia as the cause, but staff notes from her final years describe a woman who'd simply stopped engaging with life. Martha had preceded her in death by 12 years, passing in 1956 after spending her final 2 decades in almost complete catatonia. None of the children ever married or had offspring of their own. The genetic nightmare Ezra Cottle created died with his victims, a closed loop of suffering that at least could not perpetuate beyond those he'd directly damaged. The case remains sealed in Kentucky archives, accessible only to researchers who can demonstrate legitimate academic purpose. It stands as a testament to what happens when isolation, ignorance, and unchecked authority converge, creating conditions where basic human decency and biological necessity are equally violated. If this story has shown you anything, it's that silence in the face of suspected abuse is never neutral. It's complicity. Click the like button if you believe these historical cases must be examined honestly, no matter how disturbing. Subscribe so we can continue uncovering the stories that textbooks ignore. But history demands we remember.